Slicing through trees and letting them fall to the ground is protocol for lumberjacks, but when logger Tony Markins sliced through one tree, he stumbled upon something extraordinary that caused him to continue digging. Before long, he found himself rummaging through the wooden remains like a child opening birthday presents. But what was he looking for? For 43-year-old Tony Markins, being a lumberjack wasn't the most exciting career, and it was far from his dream job. But he was still very grateful for it. The job paid the bills, and his team was great. Plus, it was never boring. Every once in a while, he and his fellow loggers would stumble upon something interesting in the forest that would pique their interest. Tony couldn't imagine working a 9-to-5 job and being in front of a computer all day, trapped in an office. He loved spending his time outdoors. He needed to be outside in the fresh air doing something with his hands. The lumberjack knew his job came with its fair share of danger, but that was part of the fun. But he had no idea how dangerous his job could get. On a chilly Wednesday morning in November, things started out like any other day, but they quickly became unlike anything Tony had ever experienced on the job. The air smelled like fresh pines mixed with gasoline from the chainsaws. Tony was wearing ear protection, but he could still hear the hum of the machinery that was taking over the forest, much like the humming of a colony of bees. But he had no idea that he was just a few trunks away from making an extraordinary discovery. Sawdust was flying everywhere from the chainsaws. It was even sticking to Tony's forehead, which was now drenched with sweat. It had been a long day, and Tony was tired, so he turned off the saw to take a quick break and grab some water. That's when he saw a tree that didn't look like all of the others. Something about it was ominous. Its bark was darker than the trees surrounding it, and it was taller. The tree towered over him. Then Tony noticed something even more unusual. The tree was covered in strange bumps on its surface. The bumps were protruding from the tree bark in an odd pattern, and they were covered with moss. In all of his 10 years on the job, Tony had never come across anything quite like this before. He took another look at the trees nearby to see if they had deformities like this one, but this tree was the only one like it. Tony's first thought was the lumps were bark cankers, which are dead sections of bark on branches or the main trunk of trees. It's a disease that affects many trees, but the infections didn't impact Tony's work. Bark cankers were only important for farmers or people who could be at risk of having the rotten trunk fall on their home or car, so the logger took a closer look. Tony hadn't seen lumps like this before. Upon second look, the lumps couldn't be bark cankers. So he put his gear back on and went back to work. Tony had no expectations, but he knew the tree was hiding something very interesting. And the tree wasn't just hiding something interesting, it was hiding something completely unexpected. It was beyond anything Tony could have ever imagined. The chainsaw easily tore into the huge tree, much smoother than Tony expected. And before long he was yelling, "Timber!" at the top of his lungs. Gravity took over and the tree made a high-pitched crack. Tony could feel the vibration under his feet as the tree hit the ground, making a very loud thump. This had to have been the most dangerous cut he had ever made. With the tree hitting the ground, it seemed like the whole forest felt its impact. Even Tony's team stopped what they were doing to see what was going on. And once Tony finally caught his composure, he focused his attention to the freshly cut trunk. Within just a few seconds, Tony saw that this tree was anything but normal. There was something unusual about it. The center of the trunk had a large gash running through it, and the tree had made a protective layer around the gash. Luckily enough for Tony, the rings were still clear, so he could figure out just how old the tree actually was. The tree had to be at least 30 to 35 years old, but just as Tony was about to move on from the discovery, he saw something shiny that caught his attention. Out of the corner of his eye, Tony saw something silver embedded at the end of the trunk's gash. That's when Tony's heart started beating a mile a minute. He couldn't tell if he was excited or nervous. It was all too much for him. Tony couldn't believe what was happening, and without even thinking, he pulled out his knife and took out the shiny object. It was a lump of metal. Tony's chainsaw had just missed it by a matter of inches, almost cutting it in half. Now that the object was released, Tony was desperate to figure out what it was, so he studied it closer under the sunlight before deciding to let his team in on his discovery. He then called them over so they could take a better look. Tony's team started to make their way over, and as they started approaching, he took yet another look at the tree trunk and discovered there was so much more hidden inside. He took out his knife again, eager to remove more objects. Tony pried out another 3 metal lumps. He held the objects in his hands, turning them. He then held them toward to the sky, watching as they glistened and caught the sun's reflection. But he still had no idea what the metal lumps could be. "Anyone know what this is?" he asked his fellow lumberjacks. Tony tried not to get too excited, but he couldn't help but think that he had stumbled across hidden treasure. One member of his team picked up the lumps and started turning it around just as Tony had. But they seemed just as confused as he was. Then one of the older members of the team joined them, and he knew exactly what it was. The older worker on the team bent down to take a closer look at the mysterious lumps, and he started to laugh. Everyone was staring at him, waiting for him to reveal what they were. Someone was bored, he said while grinning. Bored? What was happening? How could 30-year-old metal have anything to do with being bored? "Feel like cluing in the rest of us?" Tony couldn't help but ask. "Some guys come out here hunting, and if they don't get anything, they get bored and fire at trees," the older man said while tugging at his beard. The rest of the team was grinning just like the older member of the group. Tony had stumbled upon old rounds from a rifle. While it definitely wasn't the treasure he had hoped for, that wasn't the only thing hidden in the trunk, and Tony wasn't willing to give up that easily. Even though Tony tried his best not to get his hopes up, he couldn't help but feel disappointed with the discovery. But he was even more determined than ever to make sure the old bullets weren't the only thing the tree was hiding. He was ready to make more discoveries, so Tony took the chainsaw and kept going with his investigation. And it's a good thing he did, because he was about to find the real treasure. Tony stripped away the wood, layer by layer. In total, he found 8 rounds lodged deep inside the tree. Someone had been really bored, or maybe they were just really frustrated. And when Tony finally got to the very bottom of the trunk, he discovered the real treasure that had been hidden away for over 3 decades, just waiting for someone to uncover it. The tree stump was nearly touching the ground. Tony had finally made his way down to the last layer of the tree stump. He gathered all of the bullets he found in a pile. They didn't belong in the forest, and regardless of whether they were worth anything or not, he was going to take them out of the forest. Tony didn't like having anything but nature in the woods, but then he found something that changed his mind. Just as Tony was about to cut the stump clean off, he saw something stuck in the corner of it. It was sparkling against the sun, just like the bullets had. He found more metal. At first, Tony assumed it was just another bullet. He moved the shrubs aside and reached for the metal, which was covered in dirt. But when he touched it, it felt much bigger than the bullets he found. It wasn't a bullet after all. Still thinking he had stumbled upon another bullet, Tony wiped the dirt off the metal. He didn't have a clean rag handy, so he used the next best thing, the end of his shirt. It wasn't until he saw the intricate carvings on the metal object that he knew what he was holding. He couldn't believe what he discovered. What was something as interesting as thing doing in the forest? This was way more valuable than old bullets. The metal casting around the object revealed to Tony that it wasn't just anything he had discovered. It had to be worth something. As if that wasn't cool enough, the inside needle of the object was still working. It was as if no time had passed. It had to be survival or hunting equipment. Do you have any idea what Tony found? If you guessed a compass, you'd be right. Tony found a compass. And it wasn't just any compass. It was one of the most well-crafted compasses he had ever come across. He couldn't believe that the compass had been lodged in the roots. A hunter had most likely dropped it during one of their outings, and after all of the years that passed, the snow and rain must have buried it next to the tree. Tony smiled, thinking about how old and valuable the compass must be. From looking at the compass, Tony knew it was old, but he had no idea just how old it was. He also had no idea how to go about figuring out who it belonged to. He looked in every corner of the compass to see if there was a name or date, but he came up empty-handed. Not wanting to make a commotion, he put the compass into the pocket of his jacket while his team continued working. But he couldn't get it out of his mind, and when he came home after work, he arranged to take it to an antique expert. As the expert looked over the compass with a magnifying glass, Tony waited anxiously. He wrote down something every few moments in his notebook, and when he finished, he looked up at Tony and smiled. He revealed to him the compass was over 100 years old. Because it was such a unique piece, it was worth around $200. Tony couldn't believe his luck. He decided to hold on to the piece and keep it as a reminder of that special day. Tony thought he was going to have an ordinary day at work, but his day became much more interesting after he stumped upon a tree that looked unlike the others. Even after facing several setbacks, the lumberjack wasn't willing to give up. His perseverance led to him making a unique discovery and coming across a valuable antique. We hope Tony finds lots of treasures in the future.